Hello, my name's Ian Corrigan and I'm a coach and instructor at Rossendale Rapid Fire Practical Shooting Team in the north of Manchester. As part of our team's ongoing commitment, we want to bring new shooters into the sport. So to cover off some frequently asked questions, we put together a short safety video explaining the core safe gun handling rules and some of the aspects of range safety etiquette that you'll encounter when you shoot practical matches for the first time. Now this video is not intended to do away with going on a safety course or perhaps going and spending some time with a club coach. Rather, it's to give you a heads up on some of the things you might expect when you first go to a match and to dispel some of the myths on the type of safety you'd expect on a practical shooting competition. Now the safety rules I'm going to go through in this video will apply equally to IPSC competitions, also known as UK PSA competitions here in the UK, NRA Shotgun League competitions can be found at Bisley, at Shield, also the Three Gun Nation matches being run in the north at Rossendale and the south at Bisley by Kentucky Firearms Club, and also to any Four Islands matches being run on a club level. So the standard safety rules that any firearms owner would know is that you always treat a firearm as if it's loaded. You just assume it is. Everybody else is going to assume it is. Just because you say, oh, it's not loaded, if the gun was pointing at their head, they're really not going to be very happy with you. So that's why you also always ensure that you keep the muzzle pointed in a safe direction. At clubs, this is often pointing upwards, so it's muzzle up, or it can be muzzle down. But most importantly, it's definitely not pointing at your feet, your hands, or at anyone else. You always ensure that your finger's off the trigger until you're ready to shoot. Now this does apply in practical shooting because you will probably be moving between shooting positions, so moving and shooting. Now a lot of frequently asked questions that we receive at Rossendale is, oh, I thought you couldn't do that, and I'm sure that isn't allowed. Well, if it's done correctly, in moving with the finger off the trigger, then it is perfectly safe. And then finally, you have to know your target and what's beyond it. So in the case of shooting it on a range, then you're ensuring that you're always shooting at the targetry and following the muzzle angles. Now I'll go into muzzle angles in a little bit more detail as to explain exactly what is a safe direction and where you're aiming your gun. So rule number one, we always assume that the gun is empty. However, when you're at a range, there could be 5, 10, 100, even 800 people if it's a world shoot, and you need to be able to demonstrate visually to these people that your gun is definitely empty. Now the use of chamber flags, or safety flags as we sometimes call them, is the best way of doing that. Now if you're at an IPSC match, an NRA match, or at a Three Gun Nation match, the use of a flag is mandatory. So that's for your shotguns and your rifles. Now, shotgun flags come in a lot of different shapes and sizes. There's a sort of Napier autosafe one. There's the safety plug style one. And then there's a sort of Tapco breech chamber flag. This is made by Tapco. It's quite well used. And it really doesn't matter what the flag is as long as it goes into the chamber. Now, at IPSC competitions and often at NRA competitions, it's preferred or it's mandatory that the flag actually goes into the chamber. So the safety plug style one, whilst it fits in the breech, it doesn't go into the chamber. But it doesn't have to be a traditional flag like so. It could be something as simple as a piece of twisted wire that inserts into the breech and doesn't fall out. The reason that we find these sort of types of ones rather useful and sort of quite popular at our club, looks quite professional, brightly coloured, and the Tapco flags insert into the chamber and don't fall out even when they're upside down inside the gun, which is good because if you're doing sort of the muzzle facing upwards, then it ensures that the flag doesn't fall out whilst it's in the rack. An important thing to avoid though is if you are going to make your own, is that you don't make your safety flag out of an old spent round, so this sort of thing. So it's an old round, it's been decapped, has a sort of cable tie pushed through it there. It's got a little bit of a flag on the back of it, so it's quite obvious that it is definitely a safety flag. Now whilst that might be quite a good idea, they're prohibited, mainly because they actually look like they're real ammunition, and it's best to just use something like a piece of wire if you're going to do a DIY job. Just because the gun has a safety flag or breech flag in it doesn't mean that you don't still treat the firearm as if it's loaded. Now, Always keeping the muzzle pointed in a safe direction is very straightforward when you come to competitions, because guns are always stored in the racks. Specifically, long guns are stored in racks when they're not in use. This rack is actually a rack in Holland at a competition that we shot through an IPSC level 3, and as you can see very clearly that they've all got flags, and you can spot which ones are my firearms because they've got a ridiculous piece of string on them. Now this is muzzle up. Certain ranges prefer a muzzle down approach. However, if it's an IPSC competition, you will always have the muzzles pointing upwards. The general rules on carry and storage are that the gun, when not being used, is either stored in the rack in an unloaded position with the flag in, or it's shouldered or slung and being carried with the muzzle pointing skywards. Long guns that are placed in a slip or a case are not required to be pointed skywards, but the action can be open or closed, but a chamber flag must be fitted at all times when the firearm is not in use. Any detachable magazines, of course, must be removed, and failure to comply with those rules is going to get you into a little bit of trouble. So it's at an IPSC match, it's very important that you just simply always keep the muzzle pointing upwards, flag in, and keep your finger off the trigger. So practical shooting is a dynamic discipline. So in order to ensure that the gun is pointed in a safe direction at all times, the range brief will indicate exactly what the safe directions are on a particular stage. Here the safe directions are 90 degrees to the meridian. So that's 90 degrees to the left of the center line of the bay, and 90 degrees to the right of the center line of the bay. Depending on the particular range, that could also be 90 degrees to the sky, or it could be restricted at the top of a backstop. If you're shooting slug, for example, it's often restricted to the backstop itself. Now you can see that a little bit better here, so that would be a straight line down the middle, 90 degrees one way, 90 degrees another, and therefore it's perfectly safe for the shooter to point his gun in any point along that 90 degree arc. As you can see, there's targets to the left and there's targets to the right on this stage, and therefore as the shooter progresses and shoots, he knows that he's perfectly safe to be pointing his gun in any of those directions. However, if he was to point outside of that arc, so in other words to the rear of that arc, then that would be immediate disqualification for the match, also known as a DQ or disqualification, and it's to be avoided at all costs. Now, assuming that the shooter has kept his muzzle within the arc, he will progress forward, down range, so towards the next sets of targets, staying within the shooting box. That's the yellow box as you can see it, and as you can see, the arc that he has followed with him. So he'll be engaging the targets to the left and to the right, and the shooting arc is sticking with him. It's almost like an invisible arc that follows him as he progresses. Now that's all well and good. As the shooter is progressing, he's shooting all the targets as he moves along. Now imagine that the shooter's got to the point and he's realised that he's missed out on the targets. So for example, on the right hand side there's 3 targets. He's realised that he's missed the right hand of those 3. Now from where he's standing, he can engage. We're still within his arc, very close to the 90 degrees, but he's still within his arc, the first white target. However, if he was to engage the right hand of those targets, so the right one on the right, the white one, then he would break the muzzle angle. So in order to deal with that, the shooter would have to backtrack, so in other words, walk backwards, step back, and bring the target back into his 90 degree angle and be able to engage the target. It's also good etiquette to indicate to the range officer that you're going to be backing up. Of course, normally when you're shooting, you're moving forwards or to the side, etc. And in this instance, you're suddenly doing a change of direction. It's very wise to inform the range officer that you're going to be reversing. Now, he's probably already spotted the target being still upstanding, and he's probably thought that you may well want to come back and get it. But in this instance, you're going to suddenly do an about turn. The range officer is going to be right on your shoulder, and therefore it's good etiquette to shout backing up or moving back to effectively engage that target within your 90 degrees and then move on to the remainder of the stage. So hopefully that all makes sense. You're able to always keep the muzzle pointed in the safe direction because you've been given the safe direction in the stage brief. In our example, you're moving within the yellow boxes, but your muzzle's able to point at any point along that 180 degree arc. Now, when you're moving, shooting, loading, and then shooting again, it's still essential that you keep your finger off the trigger unless you're ready to shoot. And that means you're only putting the finger on the trigger when you're pointing it at a target and shooting at that target. If you're loading or if you're just transitioning between targets, then the finger has to be on. Now this core principle is clearly demonstrated by our next video where Richard Burton is moving and shooting, and as you can see his trigger finger is way away from the trigger when he's not shooting. If you're finished, unload and show clear. Good time there by Richard, and as you can see he had an excellent use of a match saver, and that's certainly what we would describe as an advanced stage. It's not something we'd normally expect a new shooter to be able to get down with, because the moving backwards is a challenge, and we tend to reserve those sorts of matches for experienced shooters and people that have passed a safety course, either a UK PSA one or an NRA one. One thing we do to ensure that new shooters are able to keep their trigger finger off the trigger whilst moving is we attach a piece of grip tape to the side of the shotgun. Now this is skate tape that's available online for the top of skateboards. We've got quite a lot spare at our range. It's relatively inexpensive and it's got a good grip to it. Alternatively, you can attach anything that you can put your finger on that makes sure that you know that your finger is definitely off the trigger. It's a positive feel whilst you're moving around, and therefore you know for sure that your trigger finger is in a safe place. And the final main principle of firearm safety is that you know your target and beyond. So in IBSTIC style shooting and the NRA style shooting and 3-gun shooting, you will be given a clear stage brief of what you shoot at and what you don't shoot at. For example, if you're shooting a multi-gun stage, you'll be told that you're shooting perhaps shotgun lead ammunition on steel, and that's the steel plates like you saw in the video. You'll be shooting rifle ammunition on paper targets that will have a backstop behind them, and for example you'll have a pistol target that might be spinners, could be steel or could be paper, but effectively that's going to be given to you in the stage brief. It'll be part of the range safety brief at the beginning, and therefore you'll be very confident that if you're at a organised competition that your targets and what's beyond the targets has been taken into consideration. Of course your muzzle angles are a part of that, especially the upward muzzle angle, and again that will be in the brief. And that concludes our practical shooting safety video. Hopefully you found it of interest, and if you're a new shooter and you're looking at getting into the sport, click on the links below, and if you've got any questions don't hesitate to ask, and watch out for our next video which will be on range commands about loading, unloading, and in the event you have to stop midway through a stage. Thanks for listening.